a summer gratitude poem, basically. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen these before, but there are these tiny little cucumbers called salt and pepper cucumbers. They're very pale, and I adore them every summer whenever they finally come in. It's just a pretty short season, and you eat them with salt and pepper on salads, things like that. And so this was written a moment when we were harvesting those in the field, and I just felt this like wide sweep of gratitude for where I was and where I am right now. So this is called More. I know it's summer when we wade out into the field and pick these crisp wonders, tiny cucumbers bleached of their green as if they've already seen too much of this dazzling light and can take no more. We eat them sprinkled with salt and pepper as their name suggests, crunching through flesh so sweet it's like that of a melon. I've never seen them for sale in grocery stores, but they grow here in this soil, out of which my husband could coax almost anything with his sure touch and sharp attention. He snaps them from stems with flowers still shriveled at the ends, then hands them to me like the gifts they are, and I take each one into the bowl of my hands, a wandering monk finally at home among rolling mountains swaddled in trees and stones heaved up as round as eggs from sandy loam. So much already alive between us, so many blessings threading our days like the gold of sun, yet here I stand, holding this bounty, begging for more. So thanks everyone for listening, for gathering today.
Thank you, James. That was wonderful. Thank you. Next, we're going to introduce Judith Chalmer, and she is the recipient of the Arthur Williams Award for Meritorious Service in the Arts from the Vermont Council, and she'll read from her second collection of poems, Minnow. She currently serves on the Board of Vermont Humanities and lives in Burlington with her partner, Lisa. Welcome, Judith.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Linda, for organizing, Michelle and the Kellogg-Hubbard Library for organizing. So appreciate that. And it's so wonderful to see all your faces and names. It's so sweet. James, I loved hearing those, your poems, just beautiful detail and beautiful thoughts. So I'm going to be reading from my book, Minnow, which was published in February by Kelsey Books. If you'd like it, you can order it from Kelsey, K-E-L-S-A-Y, or from any local bookstore. You can also get it on Amazon, etc. As you can tell from the title and the cover, it's a book that's sort of steeped in natural detail. And most of the natural detail is derived from public places, state, municipal, national parks. And when I tried to make that my appreciation for people who care for and protect those public natural spaces a part of my acknowledgements in my book. And then after I learned of land recognition, which is a request by Native American peoples and Abenaki people here in particular, that we acknowledge that we are on unceded Abenaki land. And so I want to just make sure that that's part of all of my readings. The book is dedicated to Lisa, my love, my spouse, and the natural world and that love is intertwined through the whole book. And it is also my hope that it's a celebration of the place of our love in the natural world. So I'm going to start with the poem that's going to take us on a quick week-long journey through a park. Daybook. Sunday. September clouds trail the hillsides, misty eyebrows and sighs. Monday. Pancakes a little burned. Gold leaves spend all their luck on scent. Tuesday. You, a splash of yellow. You, the sun in the brook. Our legs twined like branches. Wednesday, The dog lolls on the rock. Ducks murmur to the reeds, layers added and shrugged off. Thursday, the tall reeds cupping their hands, the fire sputtering awake, quiet path to the bathhouse. Friday, the last hour of the day with its heaving, its hike, everything thrown together. Shabbat, skin softly wind-washed, tented and warm, my soul untaught, bashful and surprised. The next poem is a sequence of 10 very short poems that were part of a longer sequence that was part of the Flynn Center's celebratory performance of the 40th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, and was also part of an exhibit at the Men's Room and the same year with drawings by Marie Lepré-Grabon. Covers thrown. The gentlest bite. Pear juice runs wild on my tongue. Morning bed still warm. Tracing deep circles, seconds go by. Fingers still amid the blossoms. Gravely glancing down, the first bud lifts one petal. Those close can't hold back. Rising from dense leaves, you may see these buds or not. They will feel your touch. Later, steeped in work, morning returns. A breeze stirs. Covers thrown, you stretch. Hip pulled out of joint, the aging lover rolls flat. Old gait, part busted. Early summer, dear light melting over the grass. You completely kissed. Slowly, the tension leaves my hips to remember dawn. Morning gates flung. Still dripping, you step from the tile to oil, palm, touch, rosy, utterly. Summer dusk deepens. You draw me to the window. Moon slipped from its gown. The next poem is The Plate. I apologize for casting us back into winter. Along the road, the winter birds are stuck to the trees. It's cold. Chocolate doesn't last an hour on the plate. Something's wrong in the middle. Swallowing is hard. The birds hang round as apples, no more than an arm's distance up. Our failing steps disturb nothing but us, not the still brown birds, nor the rows of urban compost heaped beneath coverlets of stiff white gulls, nor the hawks who are somewhere in this strip of furrows and trees. We can't go far for fear of a sudden stitch, a catch of breath. This level of illness is new. We turn to go home. I realize again I'm in love. It happened in a sea of summer freckles. It happened as camembert softens in its skin, impossible to refuse. Fingers full, I'm stuffed with love. Before I knew it, the square and the oval, angled jaw, wondering brow, incalculable thin rays, all residue of smiles, were drilled into my mind, described more distinctly, more convincingly than any text I've ever learned. There are tests for what hurts her, ports and plastic tourniquets. The birds pillow their hearts in stillness. I try not to worry. I try a few foods. Neither bad joke nor limerick helps. But alone, while she sleeps, the sound loosed from my throat sings, helpless and bare as any beast alive on legs to dance across ice in the glittering night. I am granted a great love. Now to the shore. Get away. Descending the dune, sand fine and deep as snow. There is comfort in being no one known. There is so much sky, and there is walking the edge, 1 foot above, 1 below, 2 women weathered to a crinkling love. There's the luck of aging. A whole seashore empty but for us, the plummet, and wings bursting back out. Last night I watched your face above the comforter, knitted cap half on, half off, your cheek flushed in firelight, your eyes tender toward the page of a book. There was a time, summer dusk, when the children screamed, scaring themselves again and again until they were hushed, and the rituals of tooth and towel began. There were the two of us, summer and winter, padding down paths. In this sweep of sand, we sink with each step, and our lives, comfortingly small, go on, bundled in our shells like beetles scaling the rim of a bowl. What stays beneath the surface, the ocean won't tell. Not much crawls out to meet us. Perhaps a nervous shoreline skidder, something upsetting the seaweed piled with stones. But there, not far into the waves, is something we think we know. First a nose, then whiskers and curious eyes. At night, the tips of our noses ride the pillows, and our eyes deep under search again and wait to follow. And the last poem I'm going to read is The Climb. We're that couple standing at the edge, debt, second breakfast, a generous shimmer over appalling depth. Shorebirds, sinking heels, sequences beginning to fail. Today, drowsiness dogged me. We rose early. Then, try to remember. Slowly, a picture, a zigzag stairway up from the beach, and that's it. Here the banked cloud hovers over the spray. The grass so young it pokes up peacock blue against the grainy past. This is the sepia and the magic ink of aging, the moment beyond recall. My life, my mind increasingly blank. Well, I reason, who would fuss? Face out to the shore with you, reading in a chair. The cloth rim of your hat, a tender curve around everything. Yes, I remember. The climb up sweet hillsides, your body over mine and under. Salt Cove behind your knee, a great guffaw of our play. And just today as we passed, the breeze picked up a few shoots on the dune, turquoise in the sun and silver. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Next, I would like to introduce Holly Painter. Holly Painter teaches writing and literature at the University of Vermont. Her first book of poetry, Excerpts from a Natural History, was published by Titus Books, and her chapbook, My Pet Sounds Off, Translating the Beach Boys, just came out in May from Fishing Line Press. Let's welcome Holly.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much, Linda, for that introduction. And thank you also for all the organizational effort you put into this, Michelle also. And thank you all for making time this Saturday evening to come and listen to poetry. Special shout out to Ali Beam in the living room, who's watching. So as Linda said, I have two books. First is Excerpts from a Natural History, which was published in New Zealand, so your best bet really is Amazon. And then my new one is My Pet Sounds Off, which has got a nice sort of summer landscape here. I'm not going to be reading from either of these tonight. Instead, I've chosen a selection of kind of more autobiographical poems that span a real range of time and are very queer. So they're on my computer. So I'm going to do the awkward thing where I kind of do the teleprompter. And I'm like reading while looking at you. So the first one is called Assembly. Assembly. Who knows how to do a push-up? I need volunteers. Jumping Jack jogs around the stage as he talks. An orange sweatband restrains frizzy curls as a matching stopwatch bounces on his chest. Exercise is his thing. At 7, I'm all kid muscle, rangy and wound up. I love Little League. I love pickup soccer. I love the presidential physical fitness test badges my mom sewn onto my jean jacket. And I love these assemblies. Neil and I grin at each other as we climb up the steps. Now, boys' bodies and girls' bodies are a little bit different, aren't they? Penis! Comes a shout from the back. Jumping Jack misses a jog. A teacher hisses, deploying cross eyebrows and a warning finger. Now for boys' bodies, this is the right kind of push-up. Jumping Jack drops to the stage and performs a basic push-up, the kind we do in gym class. Neil and I scramble into position, poised to dip, but Jumping Jack catches my arm and pulls me up. But girls have less upper body strength, so put your knees on the floor instead. He demonstrates a clearly wimpier push-up. Neil is pumping up and down, eyes on the floor. No, I shout, as Jumping Jack poses my limbs. He flinches. The room goes quiet. My eyes burn. I don't need a girl way. I can do it right. The principal takes my hand and walks me off stage. Jumping Jack gets another volunteer. Neil doesn't tease me later. It's not important. All right, so elementary school was embarrassing, so let's move on to high school. You know things are just gonna get better and better. All right, this one's called Field Trip. Bus windows stutter open. Calves and thighs adhere to gray institutional vinyl. Squeals bounce. Dawson's Creek and Jay-Z and Who's Asked Which U of D boy to prom. Our teacher stands, grabs hold of a seat as we lurch the parking lot. Girls, quiet down. That lasts 2 minutes. My plaid-skirted classmates are back onto Gilmore Girls, AP Bio, field hockey. Beside me, my best friend. I haven't slept well since we met a year ago. My math notebook curls with letters I can't give her, and my wallet holds as treasure the one she wrote me, mundane but signed, love. As all these girls sign notes, link arms in the halls, hang photos of friends in lockers, braid hair in class, so casual in their intimacies while I cry in the library at lunch, headphones on. Oh, you're too afraid to touch, too afraid you'll like it too much. My crush, my love, my all-consuming shame and hunger, for whom I regularly lie and make excuses, whom I enable and save and spend quarter after quarter talking down from payphones all around town. Asks me what I'm reading. In my lap, a library book. Slaughterhouse-Five. She smiles. So it goes. My chest clenches. I turn my pages, try to breathe normally, not be aware of her clinking rings, her laundry soap that's different from mine, her bare, banged-up knees tucked neatly under the seat, smoothness grazing my legs at every thumping turn. Billy was helped to his feet by the lovely boy, by the heavenly androgyne. I read the sentence 3 times before nudging her. Do you know what this word means? Androgyne? She smiles again, too slowly, finds my eyes, and holds my gaze too long. Yeah, it's like you. Not quite a boy or a girl, or hard to tell. 2 girls belt out Britney Spears, and someone chews watermelon gum, and the bus rumbles onto I-75, and the wind blows my first love's hair across her face, and I have flaming cheeks and a word for myself. Okay, so I have a lot of my poems happen in cars, on buses and things. I'm from Metro Detroit. I feel like that's normal. So this next one is called To San Francisco with Paul. For a bit of context, Paul refers to my roommate when I was in college. And he is also now a poet, Paul Legault, in New York City. So, To San Francisco with Paul. We abandon our vertical sea salt Legoland in a honking, steaming, close-cuddling profession of backlit raindrops trickling down too few finite rivulets. Foot breakbound, I jabber. Paul nods, flits to another station, trains his camera to the top of the Aeon Center. Zoom, scan, pull back, looking for jumpers. None today, but he keeps skimming. US Bank, Wells Fargo, no. It's 2003 and everyone's happy today. We lose our tag-along convoy within the hour, and then there's just space And we can't figure out why LA is so crowded when here to San Francisco is just truck stops and oil derricks nodding, and those crisp white wind turbines they thought would ruin the view. But the view is just mountain crusts growing mold and creosote bushes stranded all across the flat like props from an earnest Western. We're 3 weeks Californian and already possessive of our peeling paper trees, our billboard benches, our inland seagulls nibbling strip mall trash. We're 3 weeks friends and already possessive of the other's secret, packed tight and melancholy as the cows, scented miles away. But now we've said it, it's true, and we're going to San Francisco. In this state of strangers, there's no one to mind. When the gutterball sun lands between rows of pistachio trees, we can only tell hills from sky because they're so much blacker and firmer than the backcountry firmament with its pores to ease out the pressure of all that light. We'll arrive late to a scene that's all sparkle, hills and sky reversed. We'll find no underage bars in the Castro, so we'll eat Ben & Jerry's and watch our people and wonder what people will be. But that's hours from now. We pull off for gas station tacos and sit in the forecourt, dribbling salsa and beans on our dusty flip-flops. We have no people yet, Paul and me, just each other and the hope that there's no God to mind. All right, I have 2 more. This one is called Her Blue Moons, and it is set in New Zealand. She comes at last after months of drought, of shepherd boys drinking the dew of the fields, of zebras sharing the watering holes of lions. She comes at last with the rains from the north, the flash floods, the urchins who take to treetops like kites, the delicate monkeys who can neither swim nor drown. She comes at last in the chill of an antique moon, sallow but for china blue hairline fractures around the eyes, and she wrestles a pocket button for the last dry cigarette. When her fingers scissor between mine, the dance she drags from our feet, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 is us past the glow of whitewashed warehouses, across the bridge where children watch cars burn time-lapse streaks in the alleys, past the sagging marquees of an autumn fairground where silhouettes of stiltmen gather fog in the clearing, past the dairy and the post shop to a student flat with 3 flatties, a wood stove, and David Attenborough on the television telling us we're missing almost everything. So I'm going to sort of circle back to, James started with a poem about fear and anxiety. And since I'm not reading last, I thought it'd be okay if my last poem is also about those things. And we'll let Linda clean up the mess after. So this is a poem that I wrote in January 2017. It is called The First 100 Days. The first 100 days. I want cash in hand, cheap burner phones, a full tank of gas in the car, detailed maps of the border, a meeting point on the other side. I want to make a plan now while no one's watching. But everyone says it's not time for that yet. You're being paranoid. My wife and I bathe the baby, tug a comb through his tangles. He lines up his yellow ducks, green monkey, purple hippo on the edge of the tub. In the Handmaid's Tale, it never says what happens to the Quaker family with the bathtub full of toys when Moira is captured. We eat chili on the couch, watching a sitcom from 2014. The writers didn't know they'd date the show by writing characters who aren't afraid. I can't sleep anymore. She curls around me and promises we won't wait too long, but I worry we've forgotten how to run. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ollie. Now I have the pleasure of introducing myself. So, Linda Quinlan is the winner of the Wicked Women's Poetry Prize and is co-host of All Things LGBTQ, a cable access news show. She will read from her poetry book, Chelsea Creek, which was published by Brickhouse Press in September. So there you go. And the first poem I'm going to read is, I think, fitting for the times we live in. You know, I was looking over some poems and I kept thinking, boy, you know, in the life we're living right now, our new reality, some of them seem really weird. But I will read this one. And this was my mother's experience during the 1918 flu epidemic. This is not a parade, though there are flags waving, carriages pulled by horses who want to gallop on the curb. My mother's toes play with pebbles stuck between the cobblestones. She is 9 and the oldest child. The only white horse passes, canters sideways, reined in. He jumps, bumps the wagon in front. The driver sighs from the closeness, a crunch of bodies and bones, the unmarked graves. A hand grabs for her hair as a body slides off the wagon. She jumps back, stares at the fingers, the wrinkles in the clothes. She runs into the house where her father's pipe is cradled in solid mahogany stand. Her mother's heavy green curtains are drawn tight against death, and everything vanishes into the darkness. So, and next I would like to read kind of another apocalyptic poem, which is called After the Flood. And let me see, oh, it's on page 20, okay. And this is about, well, it takes place in New Orleans. My partner and I lived there for 17 years. And so it was after Katrina. I also want to explain that there's a line in this called second lining, which is, if people don't know what this is, it is like when people are playing blues or jazz or a death march, or, you know, you see people with like handkerchiefs that are going like this, or umbrellas that are going like this. That's called second lining. So it is in this poem, After the Flood. She died after Katrina, her lungs filled with fluid, not from the flood alone, but from the coughing of toxins and fallen houses. Her only son crushed under a car the very day we walked in City Park, where the backwash of swamp ran into concrete lines as stiff as flowers around a coffin. There could have been alligators lumbering from live oak to the bayou, where symbiotic Spanish moss tangles in the branches it suffocates. But for the moment, there was only us saying life was good. Between the white columns of the art museum, a Black woman with an umbrella is second lining, all by herself, to imaginary Zydeco or the blues. Her rhythm in step with ours, I can almost hear the metal washboard sounds slipping away. I wish I had touched her shoulder or seen the universe wink. This was our moment. It was, and then it wasn't. And this is a poem about my favorite aunt, and people have heard this if they've, you know, some people have maybe and some haven't. But my aunt was a numbers runner, and I ran numbers for her, and I became a very wealthy teenager. And so this is a poem about her, and it's called Chelsea Bass, after the title of the book. Thin as her February birth, my Aunt Evie swayed with every half tone, the spontaneous steps of a child living outside Newfoundland, the fishing village of her family's past. This wasn't New Orleans, where she might have had a chance, where anger and creativity collide. This was Chelsea, a city of bad daughters and warlike sons, where nothing grew but immigrants and hunger. Her father's madness beckoned him to an ocean death, but instead he crawled into dementia, soaked in beer and sadness, the smell of urine even when he slept. My aunt married one summer a man back from the war in Europe. His pale violence swelling out of every room made her a ghost. She danced at home over the kitchen tile that curled in the corners. She danced in circles while her daughter slept. until her husband took her child away, punishing her dance, commanded a beat from the suburbs, and snapped his fingers again and again until even her suicide seemed clumsy. And this is a poem about, I wrote this, it's called Babysitting Grandsons. And it was written about the Boy Scouts before they had made some of the changes they had. I'm going to read it anyway because in order to be a Boy Scout, you have to believe in God. And I don't so much agree with that either. So anyway, this is called Babysitting Grandsons. I won't take my grandsons to the Boy Scouts, deliver them at the door of some church and wait outside, or pick them up later in uniforms decorated with badges. I'm out, as I was when you were small and lived in San Francisco. I left your father spinning a cobweb of fear around my neck until I couldn't breathe. Right now, my rib cage hurts. I don't want to fight, to have this come between us. Still, I will not take the boys, help them make me disappear, their lesbian grandmother caught between love and pleasing, and contorting desire and principles. You will take them next week when I've gone home. Decorated in duplicity, my grandsons ironed and pressed against the stilled voice in your head. At Malcolm Shabazz High School, you wore a leather jacket with a skull, built a camp of boxes to protest apartheid, slept there for weeks. Your badge, a lesbian mother, that made you the coolest of all. I would kill any monster that slipped into your room, but this I must refuse. This madness of monsters of your own making. And then I would like to read, I'd like to read this poem. It's called Montpelier, Vermont. Some people really like this, some people hate it. It was when we could travel, let me just say that, when we still had the ability to go from place to place. Montpelier, Vermont. The party was crowded with women, all white and all middle-aged. And still I felt out of place, no Merrill boots, tucked neatly by the door. And the wood stove had a pumpkin kind of face that threw heat, but not nearly enough. A woman sighs and stretches, her purple wool socks slouched down around her ankles, says, "This is the best place in the world to live." The village is full of smug, contented people with nowhere to go after 9 p.m. I wonder where she's been to believe this, but I don't ask. Certainly not to Barcelona or Mexico, where the buzz twinkles in midnight melodies of bodies, and if you fall into a ditch, it's your own damn fault. Yes, there is good health care and progressives and endless winters. So I leave the village often, carry with me the conflicted beauty of mountains that smother and soothe breasts of contentment. And for the last poem, I would like to read Almost Old. And I have to say, in all honesty, I wrote this when I was almost old, but now I'm getting more like old. So anyway, this is called Almost Old. This is my last poem. The hitch to almost being old is the idea of Florida. Strip malls and strippers, a restaurant or two next to Walmart, or the villages where Mitt Romney spoke of better days. 25 years ago, I took a train to New Orleans and stayed 14 years, living a dystopian life. Held up at gunpoint twice. The smell of jasmine stayed with me even after the police came 3 days later. Anne Rice in a coffin for Halloween and vampires in the humid mist. I can't just go anywhere anymore. 50 years ago, I moved to Aspen with 4 friends in a Jeep. The heated winter pool, lights and skiers, my first girl love. I left for San Francisco before AIDS, touching the hands of long-haired strangers. I could have found Charlie Manson there in Peace Park. Among the girls I laughed with, now Montpelier, Vermont, the smell of winter air and moaning mornings, I think of Florida. Take a nap, reliving times with old friends and saying final goodbyes, words I might have forgotten. Thank you. So now we're going to have a little talk back. I hope Michelle is here because I can't really see everybody and I can't see hands that might be raised to ask questions. If anybody has any questions, you could try raising your hand. If that doesn't work, you can just shout out, I guess. So if anybody has any question, please feel free.
Go for it, Anne.
I'd like to ask, thank you very much for a wonderful evening. Each of you write lovely poetry, each of you. And I'd like to ask each of you about influences. Who influenced you? Who or what has influenced you?
All right, who wants to start? Come on, brave folks. I'll start. Okay. My main influences early were Plath and Adrienne Rich. I worked with Martha Collins, who was my mentor and teacher at the University of Massachusetts when I went there. I also worked with Kathleen Spivak. I love Elizabeth Bishop and Eileen Miles. I sort of fancy myself a working class writer. And she really is in the lead for that. So those are my main influences. Next up.
I'm happy to go next. I've been influenced by a lot of poets. I worked with Ted Kooser when I was at Nebraska. I think that it's hard not to be influenced by the ghost of Robert Frost if you live in Vermont. So I do count him as an influence. And someone who comes to mind right now who writes such grateful and exuberant poetry is Ross Gay. I'm sort of in the midst of being influenced by him and his work. So those are mine.
Judith?
It's funny. I wouldn't want to say influenced in the sense of that I try and write by them, but they were part of my so much part of my growth as a poet. So I want to give a shout out to Melanie K. Kantrowitz and Irina Klepfish, who were here in Vermont at a time when they just dazzled me with their writing and their thinking and their politics. I also love Marge Piercy. I was studying at Vermont College when Mark Doty was there, and he was just amazing. I think in terms of naturalists, I've been, Annie Dillard, I just fell in love with her early on and have been reading Kathleen Dean Moore. Oh gosh, I hate when I forget names. Well, I'll just have to save this one for another time. You all know who she is. And yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Holly, you have anything?
And you asked me this when you interviewed me in November, and I didn't know what to say then either. But I listened to the others, and now I have some ideas. So most of the poets I'd say that influenced me are New Zealand poets, because that's where I sort of did my MFA and most of my writing. So at the risk of sounding hipsterish, you probably haven't heard of them. But For the United States, I'd say Mary Oliver and Phil Levine and Eleni Sikelianos. I'm not sure I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah. Thanks. Any other questions out there?
I have a question. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, it's Sarah Solnick. I don't want to turn my camera on because it's so messy here. But Holly invited me to this reading, which I really enjoyed. And I know that she's lived in Vermont for 4 years about. And so I guess because the last poem that was read was also about Montpelier, I guess I wonder, for how do you feel? Has your writing changed since you came to Vermont? And for other poets who, and it sounded like, again, Linda, you lived in a lot of places. So what does Vermont, how has that affected your writing?
Well, it's the first time I didn't live in an urban setting, for one thing. It influenced my writing in that, I really like living here despite the poem. I find it really, a wonderful place to be. Although I do find that it has drawbacks that sometimes, I worry about. But it has given me a lot of space to be able to write. I've met some wonderful writers here. It's a small community, so you can really get to know people in a way that you might not have living in San Francisco or in New York or Boston. So I really enjoy the closeness of the writing community and really knowing people. And I think that's really been a really good influence for me. So that's how I would answer that question. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, and that question was for any of the poets that want to answer it.
I'll take a stab at that. So I think that for me, I would echo what Linda was saying about the community. This is the first time since grad school that I'd had a kind of group of writers to bounce things off of in person. As far as the sort of influences of Vermont, I don't, it's so coincided for me with a sort of shift to really domestic topics in my writing. There's less of this driving around and having sort of ill-suited romances and more kind of, I guess the quarantiners were the good symbol of it, of a lot of stuff in my neighborhood. A lot of my poems are about, recently I wrote a poem about teaching my 5-year-old to ride a bike while discussing police brutality. And that's sort of a real national issue, but a very small scope of writing around my neighborhood and writing about things that are very particular and close to home.
Any other questions? Answer?
I'll take a stab at the Vermont question, because it does really affect my writing. And that when I came here, I was awed by the natural world and didn't come from a culture. I came steeped in Jewish culture. I still am steeped in Jewish culture, but the materials were the materials of, the metal candlesticks and the desert liturgy. And I didn't really have a way to express awe. And so I've had to grow into that, sort of weaving together the various aspects of identity and culture that I've grown up with. So it's been, was actually, and falling in love with, meeting people who had lived through the 20th century in rural Vermont and, that incredible, journey of the 20th century. So yeah, it was big.
Any other questions out there? Christy. You got to turn your, yeah, there you go.
I wanted to know if you have any particular places, each of you, that you especially like to be when you write.
Okay. I like to, where you like to write?
Yeah,
I like
place?
I write it at home in this little corner that I have that's about the size of a closet, filled with Anne's books. And so I have this small space, and I like to write there. I feel like okay, well, a small space, and I can't really pay attention to much else, so it's kind of nice. So I write in there in my little cubby hole.
Yeah, I can write anywhere that's quiet and private. I usually tend to write well after a long walk in nature. So, after a walk or hike in the park, usually a couple of lines are just kind of knocking around my head. And so I try to go somewhere, even just in the car, and just get those down and see what they want to be. So I can write anywhere, but usually spending time in nature somehow gets things going, or just moving somehow.
I used to write everything in a notebook with a pencil or a pen, and to the scandal, some people will be scandalized, but I usually write on my laptop now, which really does change the way that I write. But it's where I feel most comfortable, and so I usually write. And we don't have a backyard; I write in the front yard. Right? My neighbors are walking their dogs. I'm sitting there writing my poems.
Any other questions out there? Thanks, Christy.
Susan Marie, you're up.
Oh, thanks. Thank you all. A couple of your commentary around the poems or your answers to questions have referenced like different periods in your poetic output. And I'm just curious whether those periods are only obvious in hindsight, or whether sometimes in your creative work you really deliberately say, now it is time for a new thing, and I'm going to turn in this new thing and not do that old thing anymore. Or maybe it's just a mix of both, but I don't know, I just found that sense of periods really interesting. So I was wondering if some of you could talk a little bit about that.
I have some clear. I have written a number of sort of project manuscripts that are maybe a little bit on the gimmicky side, but are I like setting myself weird tasks. So like my Beach Boys book is very distinct. There was the time, which was about 7 years ago, that I wrote these poems, and they were about the Beach Boys. And then I've recently written a book of hasn't been published yet, but about cryptic crossword poems, and it's a very particular form that I've invented. And so it's easy for me to sort of delineate, now it is cryptic crossword time, now it is Beach Boys time. But the more autobiographical stuff, I just kind of write whenever it comes to me, and that can be any time. And then I later try and figure out what it goes with.
Yeah, I would say for me it happens really accidentally, that I don't really know what I'm working on, or kind of a thread or theme that's running through something, until I sit down and really gather the poems together and kind of put them into a manuscript form. I always think of a book of poetry as being kind of a mosaic, and that it doesn't necessarily tell a linear story, but in the process of putting them together and making a sort of design, that a story, or a certain theme or themes from a period become more evident.
Rachel, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. What I hear from writers is that sometimes they have a writer's block, and I would be interested in hearing from all of you as to, assuming that you hit this wall, what do you do to get back into, writing and creating?
So I do Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way practice every day. So she recommends writing morning pages, like 2 or 3 pages of handwritten words that just basically flow out. So free writing. So in that way, I'm basically, it's just about keeping up that practice and showing up every day.
Sometimes,
Something
go ahead.
just about the opposite of that. It'll just be writer's variety. I'm very much not a disciplined writer. And when I don't write, I just figured, oh, well, I'm not writing. I don't, I've never thought of it. I've never wanted to think of it as a productivity. There's so many ways in which industrial mode productivity governs our lives, and I've never wanted to give writing over to that. And writing is also hard, and it's. I love revising better than anything. Generating material is I'll do anything rather than do that. But somehow I keep coming back to it. It just keeps happening.
It's funny, Judith, I feel the opposite. I like to write, but I hate to revise. It's really funny how we, how we feel as writers or, whatever. I like the the bursting of, whatever. And then I'm like, oh, now I've got to look at them and I've got to work with them and I've got to fix them and I've got to, and sometimes when I can't write, I think, oh, I'm never going to write again. I mean, oh, this is it. I've had my day. I'm not doing it anymore. And then, it comes back, but I'm more like you. I don't really write every day. I don't think about writing every day, but sometimes things just pop into my head and I think, oh, wow, that's a good idea. Or that seems like it might be an interesting idea. So I work with that. But, I wish I could do it more often and be more directed and more ambitious, but I'm just not. So
I like Annie Lamott's idea of composting, where everything I'm doing is part of the writing process, and it's all just like doing its thing in my head, and then later it'll all kind of like end up on the page. But if I do want to sort of make myself sit down and do something, I do find that having some of these really specific projects with formal constraints can be a good way to get into it, because I might not feel like it's going well, but I am following the rules I set for myself. So, I get to check it off. I've done my thing now. So.
And did you have another question?
I do. Following on Rachel's question, what has been the impact of the pandemic on your writing, if any?
I'd love to start with that. We had a baby in January, so he's a pandemic baby, and we also have a 5-year-old, and also jobs. So I have written 2 full-length poems since the beginning of the pandemic, and so I don't really see my productivity really rising from there. It's gonna be a while, I think. So it's all composting. It's working on composting.
I've had some difficulty writing during the pandemic. I feel myself very distracted. I'm either watching the news or I'm obsessing about one thing or another. And, so I found it a little more, a little more difficult. It just, I don't know, it seems out of worldly. And also it feels like whatever you write is kind of like, well, if you're not writing about the pandemic and how awful it is, what is there to write about? So I'm struggling with that personally. I think I will pass through it at some point, hopefully, but I agree, Holly, it's really hard to, keep going.
Well, one of the things I can say is that my beloved writing group, and it's really nice to see Angela here, who's part of that, is meeting a little more often during the pandemic. It's like, and that's boosting me a bit. I also want to, when we think about the pandemic, I also want to talk about the pandemic of racism. And so in terms, this is more about the ways that reading is part of writing. And that is that I have been wanting to learn more about, since I've been writing nature writing, I want to learn more about African-American nature writers and environmentalists. And so that's been, you know, something that I've been doing and been interested in part because I think that one way I could look at my book is wandering around in public spaces in safety derived from white privilege. And, you know, I wanted to ask myself, well, what is an authentic response to that? And that authentic response is learning. So, and reading. So anyway, that is to me really related to a question about pandemic.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, Judy. You
Yeah.
know, I'm thinking and feeling through some of the same things, that the way I move through the world and, you know, relate to the land, and even just, you know, walking around my community in safety derived from privilege. And, you know, I would say that I've been blessed with a lot of time too during the pandemic, but that hasn't necessarily led to a lot of productivity or, you know, so many more poems produced, because one of the products of this time that we're living in, pandemic and racism and everything combined, has been so much fear and anxiety, and that always gets in the way of the creative process. But I have noticed that the more time I spend online and reading the news or watching the news, the less I write. So there seems to be a correlation there.
Yes, I agree. Okay, I think we could